While ocean acidification is considered to be one component of climate change, uh, because it's such a sort of chemistry-focused topic, it's useful to think about it separately from the other impacts of climate change. So one thing to remember is that when we're talking about acidification, we're talking about um, the pH of the water becoming lower. The numbers that we use on the pH scale, remember, the lower on the scale you go, the more acidic you go. Normally, the oceans are somewhat alkaline, right? So even though the oceans are still somewhat alkaline, they're above neutral, because we are going lower in the scale, this is called acidification. So let's take a look at what's going on that causes this and what some of the impacts are. It's important to think about the carbon cycle here first. So we have a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, and that carbon could be absorbed through the process of photosynthesis by plants and plankton in the water. But also, a lot of the carbon from the atmosphere actually dissolves directly into the water in the same way that salt can dissolve into water and oxygen, O2 molecules, can dissolve into water. Carbon dioxide can dissolve into the water. And these numbers are in gigatons of carbon every year. So 92 gigatons of carbon are being absorbed just by the surface of the oceans, which if you think about, 75% of the globe being covered in oceans, kind of makes sense. There's a lot of water out there. A lot of it's being cycled into the deep ocean, and there's carbon that's being used by living organisms, but quite a bit of it is dissolved in the water itself. When carbon dioxide is absorbed and taken into the water, those molecules interact with water molecules. And in a reversible reaction, we have carbonic acid being formed. That's a mild acid, and reversible means that carbonic acid will also dissociate into carbon dioxide and water. But as we increase the concentration of carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere, and therefore the rate at which carbon dioxide dissolves in, there is more and more CO2 being dissolved into the oceans, and therefore this reaction, the forward reaction, formation of carbonic acid, is increased. It's pushed in that direction. It's less likely for the carbonic acid to dissociate these days than it used to be. And this carbonic acid is fairly weak, but what acids do is they dissociate a hydrogen ion. That's what makes it a lower pH. And what's left over is bicarbonate. That is a little bit problematic because this bicarbonate is very, very much not useful for living organisms. Now, under normal conditions, that will then dissociate into two hydrogen ions and a carbonate ion, which is really important because that's what organisms are using for the most part to make their shells, calcium carbonate. However, as there's more hydrogen in the water, it's more likely that that hydrogen can react with carbonate and take the carbonate out of the equation. And so the shells of a lot of living organisms have less carbonate to work with and therefore have a harder time building the calcium carbonate that they need. So what we see are a couple of things. First of all, you should notice that we've got this graph here. This is from 2012, but these are data from the Lamont Doherty Earth Institute, so Columbia University's Earth and Oceanography Research Station. And the global pattern that we're seeing is that the pH is dropping most in the Arctic, the colder water regions. This is our wintertime, Northern Hemisphere wintertime. Colder water allows for more of the dissolved ions to stay, or more of the dissolved gases also to stay in solution, which is why the pH drops even more drastically there. We also have cold water coming up. There's an upwelling that's going on over here. So you've got cold water that can hold on to the carbon dioxide that's dissolved into it, and therefore we have these pockets of particularly what should be very high productivity in terms of phytoplankton and marine food webs, also having lower than average pH. And that has impact on the organisms around them. So for example, things that don't need to worry about calcium carbonate shell, like fleshy algae, so the stuff you would recognize as algae, that stuff is growing a lot more because there's more carbon dioxide in the water. However, algae that have to build build shells, which are like these coccolithophores. This is a kind of algae that makes a little shell for itself. This is made out of calcium carbonate. And under more acidic conditions, so under less basic conditions, those shells don't form properly. And so these things don't survive, they don't reproduce as well, and they're at the basis of the food chain. We also see that a lot of mollusks, have trouble making their shells, not so much the adults, but the babies. And so larvae that are starting to form their shells, or smaller organisms like pteropods, which is what we're seeing here, under ocean acidification conditions in a lab, you can see that the shell of something like this pteropod, which is a type of planktonic mollusk, it starts to deteriorate. And again, a lot of these things are very, very important in the food chain, in the marine food chain. And so those are suffering, and we see ripple effects in up the food chain. Other organisms that produce a shell, like echinoderms, sea urchins and sea cucumbers, actually make little bones, and their research shows that those are having difficulty under ocean acidification conditions. Corals, again, major shell producers, need a lot of calcium carbonate. And then the other thing that we see is that organisms like fish, although they themselves don't necessarily have the problems associated with ocean acidification when it comes to building bone, when their food and their habitat is affected, then their populations are affected as well. Another interesting point in this is that the oxygen exchange that happens at the gills is influenced by pH. And so as the pH of the environment drops, the ability of fish gills and other oxygen exchange mechanisms also decreases. And so that is potentially a problem. We see that currently in freshwater and more confined ecosystems, but it is potentially a problem if pH continues to drop globally.